The first thing Stella Bristol did when she stepped off the stagecoach in Harlan Creek, Nevada, in the spring of 1878, was nearly get knocked flat on her back by a horse that had no business running loose down the middle of Main Street. She caught herself on the wooden post of the stage depot, gripping it with both hands, her traveling bag swinging wildly off her shoulder, her hat tilted clean sideways over one eye. For a single, humiliating second, she stood there with the dust settling around her boots and half the town watching from the boardwalk, with the particular expression that said they had already made up their minds about her. She straightened her hat. She picked up her bag. She looked at the row of faces staring at her with a cool, level gaze that she had spent the better part of 25 years perfecting, and she walked forward like she owned every plank of that boardwalk. She had come west to prove something, and she intended to prove it thoroughly. The something in question had a long history. It stretched back to a parlor in Cincinnati, Ohio, where her father, Thomas Bristol, had sat in his leather chair on the evening of her 24th birthday and explained to her, with great patience and considerable condescension, that women simply were not suited to the management of land. Not real land. Not the kind of land that required fences and water rights and decisions about cattle. The Bristol family had recently inherited a parcel of property in Harlan Creek, Nevada, left by her mother's older brother who had died without a wife or children. Her father had intended to sell it immediately. Stella had looked at the deed, looked at the land description, looked at the surveyor's notes that described nearly 400 acres of grassland with reliable creek access, and she had said, very quietly, that she would like to go west and work it herself. The silence in that parlor had been the kind that could fill a church. Her father had said no, of course. Her two older brothers, Gerald and Martin, had laughed the way men laugh when they think something is too absurd to take seriously. Her mother had pressed her lips together in a way that meant she privately agreed with Stella but would not say so. Her father's business partner, who happened to be visiting that evening, had offered the opinion that a young woman alone on a frontier property would be eaten alive, metaphorically and possibly literally. Her brothers had laughed again. Stella had listened to all of it. She had let them finish. And then she had said she would be leaving on the 3rd of March, and she would write when she arrived, and she would send word when she had made a success of the place. They had not believed she would actually go. She had gone. Now she was standing in Harlan Creek, Nevada, with dust on her boots and a tilted hat, and the address of the general store in her pocket, where she was supposed to collect the key to the property office. And she was absolutely certain that every single person who had doubted her was already forming a satisfying image in the back of her mind to prove wrong. The general store was easy enough to find. It occupied the largest building on the main street, with HAGGERTY's General Goods painted in big white letters across the front window. Inside, it smelled like leather and dried beans, and the kind of competent organization that suggested someone ran a tight ship. Behind the counter, a round-faced man with a ginger mustache squinted at her when she came through the door. "Stella Bristol," she said, before he could open his mouth. "I believe there is a packet of paperwork waiting for me. Property on the South Creek Road. My uncle was William Crane." The man's eyebrows went up. "William Crane's niece. I'll be." He reached under the counter and produced a thick brown envelope. "You come to sell, I suppose. Coulter Brothers out of Reno have already made inquiries. Good price, too." "I have not come to sell," Stella said. She took the envelope and tucked it under her arm. "I have come to run it. Could you tell me where I might find the surveyor's office? I would like to know exactly where my property lines sit before I do anything else." The man stared at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Across the street, 2 doors down. Ralph Holloway runs it." He surveyed most of this valley. "Thank you," Stella said and turned to go. "Miss Bristol," she stopped. The man's voice had softened slightly. "This isn't Cincinnati. Things out here don't always go the way you plan them." She looked back at him over her shoulder. "Very little in my life has gone the way other people planned it for me," she said. I find that works out better in the end." She walked out into the white afternoon sun. The surveyor's office was a narrow building sandwiched between a barber shop and what appeared to be an attorney's office, with a hand-painted sign above the door that read RHOLLOWAY, Land Survey and Mapping. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. It was a good room. That was her first thought. She was not expecting to have a first thought about the room at all, but the space had a kind of ordered intelligence to it that she could not help noticing. Maps covered every inch of the walls, pinned with careful precision, each one labeled in a neat, steady hand. A long drafting table took up the center of the room, lit by two good oil lamps even in the middle of the afternoon because the single window did not offer much. The desk at the back was covered in paper, but in a way that suggested the owner knew exactly where everything was. The owner himself was crouched on one knee near the front corner of the room, frowning at a compass he was holding up to the light from the window. He was somewhere in his late 20s, she guessed, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that was already showing the beginning of an afternoon shadow. He wore a plain work shirt with the sleeves rolled up and canvas trousers with dried red clay on both knees. He did not look up immediately, which she found interesting. "Be with you in a moment," he said. His voice was low and unhurried. He rotated the compass a fraction of an inch, checked the needle, seemed satisfied, and then set it on the windowsill and stood up. When he turned and saw her, his expression did not change the way men's expressions usually changed when they saw a woman in a surveyor's office. There was no flicker of surprise, no quick recalibration, no faint amusement. He just looked at her the way he had been looking at the compass, with alert, neutral attention. "Good afternoon," he said. "What can I do for you? I am Stella Bristol. My uncle was William Crane. I have just arrived from Cincinnati to take over the property on the South Creek Road, and I would like to look at the most recent survey of the land before I ride out to inspect it." He crossed to the long drafting table without hesitation. "Crane's property. I surveyed it 2 years ago. Give me a minute." He began moving through the map rolls stacked in an angled shelf along the wall with the efficiency of someone who had an exact system. He pulled one out, unrolled it on the table, and weighted the corners with 2 flat river stones and a brass inkwell. Stella came to stand beside him. She looked at the map. 412 acres, Ralph said. He ran one finger along a line near the center of the map. "The creek runs here, cuts diagonally across the northeast quarter. That is your best grazing ground right there, the section between the creek and this ridge. The southwest section is rougher, more rock, less grass, but there's decent timber if you needed to build." She leaned in and studied the lines carefully. "What about water rights? The creek, who else is drawing from it upstream?" He glanced at her sideways just briefly, and she had the odd impression he was pleasantly surprised by the question. "Coulter brothers own the land north of you. They have rights to draw during dry months, established before your uncle filed, so that is already settled. But your section of the creek is protected. William Crane was thorough about that. What condition is the main structure in?" "Modest. Your uncle built a good solid house, stone foundation, 2 rooms. The barn is sound, but the fencing is in poor repair. He did not run much stock in his last 2 years. Ralph looked back at the map. "If you are planning to run cattle, you will need to spend money on fencing before anything else." "I am planning to run cattle," she said, "and I know about the fencing." She waited for him to say something about the improbability of that. She was so accustomed to the pause, the polite redirect, the suggestion that perhaps she ought to speak to someone more qualified about the specifics of ranching operations, that she had already prepared her response. He just nodded. "I can put together a note on the specific sections that need priority repair if that would help. The northeast pasture fence is the weakest. You do not want to lose stock through there in your first season." She looked at him for a moment. "That would be very useful," she said slowly. "Thank you. I can have it ready tomorrow morning," he said. "Are you staying at the hotel on 2nd Street? "I am staying at my property," she said, "starting tonight." He looked up from the map then, fully this time, and their eyes met across the wide paper spread between them. His eyes were a dark, steady brown, and they held not a trace of the skepticism she was so accustomed to encountering. "Then I'll bring it out to you," he said simply. "I need to check a boundary marker on the South Road anyway. I can swing by in the morning." "You don't need to do that." "I know," he said, "but I will if it's all right with you." Something shifted in her chest in a way that she chose not to examine. "It's all right with me," she said. She rode out to the property in the late afternoon on a rented horse from the livery, following the directions she had gotten from the stage driver, and she arrived at the gate as the sun was coming down behind the ridgeline to the west and filling the sky with a color she had never seen in Cincinnati, a deep burning orange that bled into rose and then into a violet so rich it looked like cloth. She sat on the horse and looked at it for longer than she intended. Then she looked at the land. The grass was tall from spring rain, pale gold where the light caught it, moving in long, slow waves when the evening wind came through. The creak was audible from the gate, a low, steady sound she could feel in her chest before she could properly hear it. The house was small and plain and honest-looking, and the barn had a slight lean to it but nothing that looked irreparable, and the fence was, as Ralph Holloway had said, in genuinely poor repair. But it was hers. She dismounted, tied the horse to the gate post, and walked the last 100 yards to the house on foot, through the tall grass in the orange light. She opened the door and stood in the threshold and breathed in the smell of old wood and stone and the particular silence of a place that had been waiting. "All right," she said to no one and to herself and to every person who had ever laughed. "Let us begin." The first week was harder than she had expected, which meant it was harder than anything she had previously experienced because she had expected it to be very hard indeed. The well needed clearing. The pump handle was loose. The loft in the barn had a section of rotten board that put her foot through it the second morning, which resulted in a spectacular drop of about 4 feet and a bruise on her hip the size of a dinner plate. She found a family of raccoons in the corner of the tack room, and the negotiation involved to resolve that situation left her with a small scratch on her forearm and a great deal of respect for raccoons as a species. But she worked. She worked with the focused, meticulous determination of someone who had something to prove to a very specific audience, and she worked with the additional drive of someone who had looked at that land in the orange evening light and found that she wanted it for its own sake, separate from any argument with Cincinnati. Ralph Holloway arrived on the second morning as promised, riding a bay horse with a leather saddlebag over one hip. She was on the roof of the barn at the time, attempting to evaluate the state of the shingles, which meant she saw him come up the lane from a height that let her watch his face as he spotted her up there. He looked up at her with the even expression she was beginning to think was simply how his face worked. He did not look alarmed or scandalized. He just shielded his eyes against the morning sun and said, "How is it up there?" "Worse than I hoped and better than I feared," she said. "Give me a minute." She climbed down the side of the barn, using the wooden rungs someone had helpfully nailed into the boards at some point, and she dropped to the ground and dusted her palms on her work skirt. He handed her a folded paper from the saddlebag. "The fencing notes," he said. "I marked the 3 sections that need attention first. The one along the creek bank will take the most material, but it is the most important." She unfolded it. It was detailed and clear, with small sketches of the specific fence types that worked best in each terrain, and notes on which local suppliers had the best-priced lumber and wire. He had marked the approximate number of posts needed for each section. She looked at it for a while, then she said, "This is thorough." "Your uncle was a good man," Ralph said. "He deserved a property that was well cared for, so does the land itself." That was a peculiar thing to say, she thought, and she meant it as a compliment. "Thank you," she said. "Can I ask you something?" "You can ask me anything." "Why are you helping me? You do not know me. You are not being paid for this." He thought about it for a moment in a way that told her he was actually thinking about it, not just reaching for the nearest polite answer. "I suppose," he said, "because you asked the right questions yesterday, about water rights and fencing priorities. Most people who come out here to take over a property ask how much they can sell it for, You asked how to make it work. That is worth a little extra time." She looked at him steadily. "And you do not have any reservations about the fact that I intend to run it myself? That I am—" She stopped, not wanting to say it like she was asking for his approval. "That you are a woman." He said it for her without any inflection that made it feel like a judgment. "No, not particularly. The land doesn't know or care. The cattle won't either. The only people who will have reservations about it are people who don't know you yet." He took up his horse's reins. "The Coulter brothers might give you trouble. They had their eye on this property." "I know about the Coulter brothers," she said. "I read the letters my uncle left with the attorney." He nodded. "Then you know they are not above using pressure to get what they want." "Everyone I have ever met has been above or below using pressure to get what they want," Stella said. "I have considerable experience with that." Something moved briefly across his face that might have been the beginning of a smile. It did not quite get there, but it was close. "I'll check the boundary marker and let you get back to your roof," he said. "Good luck with the shingles." He rode off along the fence line. She watched him go for a moment and then went back to the barn. Over the following weeks, Harlan Creek made its various opinions known. The hotel owner's wife, Mrs. Darby, told her when she came into town for supplies that she thought what Stella was doing was terribly brave, but perhaps a little foolish. And she said both things with equal sincerity. The man at the lumber yard overcharged her by 15% on her first order, which she discovered when she checked his figures against the list Ralph had given her. And she went back and corrected it in a conversation that was civil, but left no room for ambiguity about her arithmetic skills. The attorney, a Mr. Fowler, tried 3 times in the first month to suggest that it might be in her best interest to accept the Coulter brothers' standing offer for the property, and each time she politely declined, with the kind of politeness that contained iron at its center. The Coulter brothers themselves appeared in person on a Thursday afternoon in early April. There were 2 of them, Dale and Pierce, big men in their 40s, with the casual confidence of people who had been the largest presence in a room for so long they had forgotten the room could have other contents. They rode up the lane without invitation, which was itself a statement, and Dale Coulter did most of the talking while his brother Pierce stood to one side and looked at the fence line with the appraising expression of a man who was already calculating how to repaint it. "Miss Bristol," Dale said, with the particular warmth men use when they want something. "We've been looking forward to meeting you. We knew your uncle well, good man. We were sorry to hear he passed." "Thank you," Stella said. She was standing on the porch with her arms folded, which was not a hostile posture, but it was a grounded one. "The thing is," Dale continued, "your uncle and we had an understanding, informal like, that when the time came we would have first conversation about this land. It sits right between our north and south sections, you see. Makes sense for all of it to come together." "My uncle left the property to me," Stella said. "He did not leave an obligation to sell it." Of course not," Dale smiled. "We are not suggesting any obligation, just a conversation about fair value. We are prepared to offer a price that would set you up very comfortably back east. A young woman alone out here, it's a hard life. We are trying to be neighborly." "I appreciate the gesture," Stella said. "My answer is no. If that changes, you will be the first to know. Now I have fencing to attend to." Pierce Coulter had not spoken once. As they turned their horses to go, he looked back at her over his shoulder with a flat, considering expression that she did not like at all. But she held his gaze until he looked away, and when they had gone back down the lane she stood on the porch for a long moment and breathed carefully through her nose. She told Ralph about it the next time he stopped by, which was a Friday, ostensibly to return a spirit level he had lent her the previous week. She had not asked him to lend it. He had simply noticed during a brief visit that she was using a bucket of water as a makeshift level for a fence post, and had come back the next day with the actual tool. She had decided to think of him as a useful neighbor and nothing more, which was an active decision and not a passive one, which said something. "Pierce is the one to watch," Ralph said, when she described the visit. They were standing at the northeast fence section. She was in the process of repairing. and he was handing her wire staples from the supply bag while she worked the wire into place along the new post. They had fallen into this kind of easy task sharing without ever discussing it, which she had also noticed. Dale is all talk and theatrics. Pierce is the one who thinks. What kind of trouble could they actually make? They could challenge your water rights in court, though they would lose. They could interfere with your access to the South Road, which is a shared easement. They could discourage people in town from doing business with you. He paused. They have done all of those things to smaller operations before. Nothing you can't navigate, but you should know it's possible. She drove a staple home with a hammer and did not look at him. You know a great deal about the business dealings of everyone in this valley. Surveyors hear things, he said. People talk in front of us the way they talk in front of doctors and barbers, like we are furniture. She did look at him then. Do people talk in front of you because they forget you're there or because they trust you? He considered this seriously. Both, depending on the person. Which is it with me? He met her eyes. The afternoon light was long and golden, and it made the dark color of his eyes warmer than it otherwise was. Neither, he said. With you I just want to talk. She turned back to the fence before her face could do anything complicated. Hand me another staple, she said. He did, and there was the faintest edge of amusement in his voice when he said, Yes, ma'am. She thought about that for longer than was reasonable. May came in warm and dry, and Stella bought her first cattle, 20 head of mixed stock from a rancher named Oaks who was reducing his herd before moving his family to California. It was not a great herd, but it was a solid start, and she drove them herself with the help of a young man named Louis Reyes she had hired on a trial basis. A 19-year-old who had been working odd jobs around the valley since coming up from Texas with a trail drive the previous autumn and deciding to stay. Louis was quick, good with horses, and had a gift for knowing what cattle were about to do before they did it, which was a gift that Stella recognized immediately as rare and valuable. The day she drove the cattle through the newly repaired northeast gate and watched them spread out into the creek pasture, she stood at the fence and felt something settle in her chest that she did not have immediate words for. It was satisfaction, partly. Pride, partly. But underneath both of those things there was something softer and less expected, something that had to do with the land itself, and the way the cattle moved through the tall grass with the creek running behind them and the ridgeline blue in the distance. She had not expected to love it. She had expected to succeed at it. Those had turned out to be different things. Ralph came by that afternoon and found her still standing at the fence looking at the pasture. He reined in beside her and looked at the cattle in the grass. First 20, he said. First 20, she agreed. They look good, that's solid stock. Oaks knew what he was selling, he was fair about the price. She was quiet for a moment. I wrote to my father, Ralph waited. I told him I had the land running, first stock purchased, fencing repaired. I described the property. She paused. He wrote back. He said I had done better than expected and that perhaps I ought to consider selling while the value was good and coming home before winter. What did you write back? I told him I would be here for spring roundup next year. Ralph looked at her with an expression she was beginning to be able to read, the particular attentive stillness that meant he found something genuinely interesting. Good, he said. You don't think I ought to go home? I don't think Harlan Creek would survive the loss, he said, and the tone was light but something underneath it wasn't, and she looked at him sharply. He was looking at the cattle again, his expression neutral, and she could not tell if he meant the town or something else. She decided not to ask. Not yet. Have dinner with me in town on Saturday, she said instead, which surprised her as she said it. It came out more directly than she had intended, less casual. He turned to look at her. His expression was very careful for a moment, like a man placing his feet on uncertain ground. I would like that, he said. Saturday arrived with the peculiar weight of things that have been anticipated. Stella dressed with more deliberation than she usually gave to getting dressed, which she acknowledged privately and dismissed publicly. She wore her best blouse, a deep blue cotton, and her good skirt, and she pinned her dark hair up in the way she liked best, which was neatly but not so formally that it looked like she had been trying. She looked at her reflection in the small mirror in the bedroom and thought that she looked like herself, which was exactly what she wanted. Ralph was waiting outside the restaurant, which was in fact the dining room of the hotel on 2nd Street, with an extension added at some point that gave it a separate entrance and enough tables to be properly called a restaurant. He had made his own effort with his appearance, she noted. Clean shirt, collar straight, hair actually cut, which was an improvement. He looked more like himself too, she thought, in the way that dressing carefully could either make a person look unlike themselves or could clarify them. He looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, open and direct and undisguised, and she felt the warmth of it in a way that she could not simply decide not to examine any further. "You look very nice," he said simply. "Thank you," she said. "So do you." They went inside and were seated by a window that looked onto the street. The restaurant was half full, and she was aware of the eyes that tracked them as they came in, the quiet recalibration of the room's social map. She ignored it with the ease of long practice. The food was better than she expected: roasted chicken, fresh bread, beans that had actually been properly seasoned. The conversation was easy in the way that conversations are easy when the people having them have been building toward it for several weeks without entirely admitting it. She told him about Cincinnati, about her father's house with its heavy curtains, and its opinions about what women could and could not do. She told it without self-pity, as a series of facts that had led to other facts that had led to her standing in a Nevada Creek pasture watching cattle graze. He listened with the same quality of attention he brought to everything, which was complete and unhurried. He told her about where he had grown up, which was Missouri, the son of a schoolteacher mother and a father who had run a small printing business. He had come west at 22 after 3 years of working as a junior surveyor in St. Louis, drawn by the sheer undifferentiated scale of the western landscape, by the way the maps in this part of the country still had blank spaces. He had a feeling about blank spaces, he said, that other people might call restlessness but that he thought of as curiosity. "You're describing this valley like it's the whole world," she said. "When you're in it," he said, "it is." She looked at him across the table. The lamp between them threw a warm, unsteady light across his face. "I know what you mean," she said quietly. "I did not expect to feel that. I expected to feel competent and vindicated. I did not expect to feel as though the land was particular, like it was choosing me as much as I was choosing it." "That's exactly it," he said, and the way he said it, quickly and with a kind of relief, told her he had been carrying that feeling for some time and hadn't had anyone to say it to. They sat in the restaurant until the other tables had emptied, and the proprietor, Mr. Selden, was politely removing candles from the other tables in a sequence that moved gradually closer to theirs. On the walk back to where she had tied her horse, the night was full of stars and the town was quiet. He walked beside her at a pace that had no urgency in it. "I want to tell you something," she said when they reached her horse. "All right. I came here to prove something to people who told me I couldn't do this. That's the truth of why I came. Not entirely because of the land or the opportunity, though those things are real now, but the beginning of it was anger. I need you to know that because I don't want to build anything on a foundation I'm not being honest about." He was quiet for a moment, looking at her. "I know," he said. "How?" "Because it's the same thing that brought most of the best people out here," he said. "Anger or grief or the need to prove something. It doesn't make the thing you build less real. It just means you fought for it harder." She looked at him in the starlight. The night air was cool and smelled like sage. "You are a very unusual man, Ralph Holloway," she said. "I'm a straightforward man," he said. "I just say what I think." "That is extremely unusual," she said. He laughed then, a real laugh, low and warm, and she thought it was the best sound she had heard since coming to Nevada. He rode home north on the main road and she rode south on the creek road, and halfway home she realized she was still smiling. June came with heat and work, and the beginning of a rhythm that Stella had not had before in her life, a daily rhythm that was entirely her own. She rose at first light and she worked until the heat drove her inside at midday, and she worked again from the long afternoon until dark. She learned things daily, practical things: how to read the creek level, how to tell when a fence wire was near to breaking before it actually broke, how to read the sky for the kind of summer thunderstorm that came down hard and fast off the ridge. Louis Reyes was a good presence on the property, steady and skilled, and she paid him fairly and told him directly what she needed, which seemed to be the management style he responded to best. She and Ralph saw each other with a frequency that could no longer be called coincidental. He came by the property for various reasons, some professional and some not, and she came into town on supply days and found herself stopping at the narrow office between the barber shop and the attorney whether she needed a map or not. Harlan Creek noticed, of course. Small towns notice everything. Mrs. Darby mentioned it to her with considerable happiness and a degree of romantic projection that Stella found both touching and slightly alarming. Mr. Haggerty at the general store began to ask after Ralph with a subtle knowing smile when she came in for supplies. Even the attorney, Mr. Fowler, made an oblique reference to it once during a discussion of her property taxes. She did not mind. She was used to being observed. What she found herself doing, in the privacy of the house in the evenings, was thinking about Ralph Holloway with a warmth and a regularity that she was beginning to understand was not neighborly interest or professional respect. It was something older and more demanding than either of those things, something she had not particularly planned for when she packed her bags in Cincinnati. He was not like the men she had met before him. The men in Cincinnati had been either intimidated by her or trying to manage her, often both at the same time. They had looked at her with either excessive deference or excessive control, and had seemed to find her genuine opinions an inconvenience to be navigated. Ralph looked at her like she was simply herself, not a puzzle to be solved or a problem to be handled, but a person with a particular way of thinking that interested him. It was, she had discovered, one of the most profoundly attractive qualities a person could have. She was thinking about this on a Wednesday evening in late June when he arrived at the property unexpectedly, which was unusual enough that she immediately knew something was wrong. She was on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sunset, when she saw him coming fast down the lane. "Dale Coulter filed a motion with the county assessor today," he said as soon as he was close enough to speak at a normal volume. He dismounted without the usual pause. "He is claiming your uncle never properly registered the water rights transfer when he bought the land from the original homesteader. If it goes through, it would put your creek access in dispute." Stella set down her coffee cup. "Is there merit to it? It depends on the paperwork. If William Crane's deed included the water rights registration, they have nothing. If there was a gap in the filing," he shook his head. "It's a legal attack, Stella, pure and simple. They cannot buy you out, so they are trying to make the land unusable." She was already thinking. "The deed is in the attorney's office. Mr. Fowler has the full file from the original purchase. Fowler also represents the Coulter brothers on some of their land transactions," Ralph said carefully. She looked at him. "You think Fowler might have a conflict of interest? I think you should look at that deed yourself tonight and see what it says." She went into town that evening, arriving at Fowler's office at the edge of dark. The attorney was still in, which was fortunate, and she sat across his desk and asked to see the complete deed and registration papers for her property. Fowler was visibly uncomfortable, which told her something immediately. She read every page with the careful attention she had always had for written material, and near the bottom of the third page she found what Ralph had suspected: a notation of water rights registration that had been filed with the county, with a reference number. The registration was valid. The Coulter brothers' motion was without basis. She had Fowler write her a certified copy of the relevant page on the spot. He did so with the sulky efficiency of a man who knows he has been caught in a quiet compromise and has no room to argue. She stopped at Ralph's office on the way back out of town. He was still there, working by lamplight on a map that stretched the full width of his drafting table. "It's valid," she said from the doorway. "The registration is on page 3, reference number and all." He straightened up. In the lamplight, the relief on his face was clear and real. "Good. File a counter response with the assessor tomorrow morning, first thing." "I will," she said. She stood in the doorway for a moment. "You rode out at sunset to warn me. You didn't have to do that." He looked at her steadily. "I know." "Ralph." She was not quite sure how to say what she wanted to say. She was not a person who said things she was not sure of, and this was territory she was not sure of. But she had learned over the last 4 months in Nevada that the land had no patience for people who were not honest about what they wanted. "I think," she started again. "I do not know what to do with a person who simply trusts me. I have not had a great deal of practice with it." He came around the drafting table. He crossed the room until he was standing close enough that she could see the lamplight moving in his eyes. He said, "I have always trusted you. From the first day you walked in here asking about water rights." "That was the second question I asked," she said, and her voice was not quite steady. "I know," he said. "The first question was about the survey lines." "That was also a good question." She laughed, which was not what she had been expecting herself to do. And then he lifted one hand and touched her jaw very gently, the way you would touch something you were afraid of startling, and she looked up at him, and all the things she did not have words for were suddenly very near the surface. "I think you should kiss me," she said. "I was hoping you would say that," he said. He did. It was not a tentative kiss. It was the kind of kiss that arrives after a long approach, certain of its destination, warm and unhurried and thorough. And when it ended, she stood in the lamplight with her hands against his chest and her forehead tipped forward against his chin. And the whole valley was quiet outside the windows. And she thought that this was something she had not arrived in Nevada to find, but that it had found her anyway with the stubborn insistence of things that are supposed to happen. "I should go home," she said into the front of his shirt. "You should," he agreed without moving. "I have to file a counter response with the assessor first thing tomorrow." "You do," he said. "And Lewis is alone at the property." "Yes." She stepped back. She looked at him. He was looking back at her with the same direct, undisguised expression she had first seen at the restaurant table, the one that didn't try to be anything other than what it was. "I will see you tomorrow," she said. "You will," he said. She rode home under the stars, and the counter response was filed before 8 in the morning, and the Coulter brothers' motion was dismissed by the county assessor by the end of the week. The summer deepened. Stella's cattle thrived in the creek pasture. She hired a second hand, a quiet, steady man named Frank Odom, who had been working for a neighboring ranch, and was looking for something steadier than seasonal work. With Lewis and Frank, the work of the property became manageable in a new way, not easy. The land was never easy, but possible to sustain rather than merely to survive. She and Ralph became, in the way of two people who have already been building something without naming it, a presence in each other's lives that the whole town of Harlan Creek had settled into accepting as obvious. They had dinner together twice a week when he was not out in the valley on survey work. He brought her coffee in the mornings sometimes when she came into town on Thursdays. She brought him a meal once when she knew he had been working straight through for 2 days finishing a survey that a land company needed by a deadline, and she set it on his drafting table and sat across from him and watched him eat with the hungry gratitude of a man who has forgotten that food exists until reminded. "You don't have to feed me," he said. "I know," she said, in the same voice he had used on her. And he looked up, and the expression on his face was so warm and clear that it made her chest feel full. He met her on the property one evening in August when he had been working the south section of the valley all day, and she had been managing a difficult situation with a section of the creek bank that had collapsed under the weight of the spring cattle traffic. They were both tired and dirty, and she had mud on her hands, and he had red clay on his boots, and they sat together on the porch steps in the long August evening light and talked without any of the social formality that town required, and she thought that this, specifically, was what she had not known to want. Not just romance, Not just partnership, but the specific ease of two people who had no performance to give each other. "My brother Gerald is coming to visit in September," she said. Ralph looked at her. "The one who laughed." "That one, yes." She had told him about the Cincinnati parlor, the full story of it, one evening in July. He had listened without interrupting, and at the end he had said quietly that her family had made a significant error in judgment, which was such an understatement that it had made her laugh until her eyes watered. "What do you think will happen?" he asked. "I think he will arrive expecting to find a disaster, and will find a working ranch instead," she said. "I think he will be gracious about being wrong because Gerald is not a bad man. He is just a man who had not updated his picture of me from when I was 16. I intend to show him the water rights documentation, the cattle records, and the fencing repairs in that order. And then," she smiled, "and then I will introduce him to you." Ralph was quiet for a moment. "What will that mean?" She looked at him. "I think you know what it will mean." He did know. She could see it in his face. He turned to look at her, and there was a question there that he was measuring whether or not to ask directly. "I am not going back to Cincinnati," she said. "I want you to know that. Whatever this is between us, it is not a temporary thing on my part. I am here. This is the place I have chosen." "I know that," he said, "and I am not the kind of woman who needs to be managed or handled or decided for. You already know that too." "I know," he said. "I have known it since you asked about water rights 5 minutes after arriving from Cincinnati." "Then what I am saying," she said, "is that if you are thinking what I think you are thinking, I am asking you to think it directly and say it out loud." He looked at her for a long moment. The evening light was doing what evening light does in Nevada, turning everything golden and improbable. A night hawk called from somewhere over the creek. "I love you," he said, with the same directness he brought to everything. No ceremony, no preamble, just the fact of it spoken clearly. She had been waiting for those words, she realized, since approximately the second week of April. "I love you too," she said, in the same straightforward tone, because that was who they were, both of them. He reached over and took her muddy hand in his clay-covered hand and held it, and they sat on the porch steps in the August light, while the night birds began to call over the creek. Gerald Bristol arrived on the 15th of September on the afternoon stage, and he was everything she had expected and a little more. He was 32 years old and looked very much like their father, with the same heavy jaw and the same habit of surveying a room before committing to entering it. He stood in the door of the main house and looked at the stone walls and the timber ceiling and the good solid furniture she had bought from a craftsman in town, and his expression went through several stages before arriving at something that was close to impressed, or at least not able to maintain dismissiveness. She showed him the cattle in the creek pasture. She showed him the repaired fencing and the expanded hay storage. She showed him the water rights documentation and the cattle records and the accounts ledger she kept with meticulous precision. He looked at all of it with the quiet attention of a man being asked to revise a long-held position. "This is legitimately good work, Stella," he said, finally, that evening after dinner. "I know," she said. "Father will want to see the accounts." "Father can write me a letter asking to see the accounts and I will consider it." Gerald looked at her across the table. "You are different." "I am the same," she said. "You are seeing me for the first time." He was quiet for a moment. Then, with a kind of effort that she recognized as Gerald trying to be honest, he said, "We were wrong to laugh." "Yes," she said, "you were." "I'm sorry, Stella." She looked at her brother's face and saw the genuine discomfort there, the recognition of a failure that could not be undone, only acknowledged. She reached across and put her hand briefly over his. "I know," she said. "Now let me introduce you to someone." Ralph came to dinner the following evening. He and Gerald shook hands on the porch with the careful evaluation of men who are in the early stages of deciding what to think of each other. But over the meal, which Stella had cooked herself with the competence she had developed over months of feeding herself in 2 ranch hands, something easier began to develop. Ralph talked about the valley's land patterns, about the survey work that was remaking the Western Territories map by map, about the creek watershed and the way it fed the whole south end of the valley. Gerald, who was a practical man underneath his conventional opinions, was genuinely interested, and by the time the evening was done, they were talking comfortably, and Stella was watching them both with a satisfaction that had several layers. When Gerald left 2 days later, he stood by the stage with his bag and he looked at his sister in her work clothes with her hair pinned up and her boots dusty, and he shook his head slowly. "What?" she said. "You look like you belong here," he said. "Like you were always supposed to be here." "I was," she said. He kissed her cheek. "I'll tell father it's not what he expected," he said. "Tell him it's better," she said. He laughed and stepped up into the stage, and she watched it rattle off down the main street, and then she went back to work. Autumn moved through the valley with a beauty that surprised her even though she had been told to expect it, the way beauty always surprises even when you know it's coming. The aspens in the high draws turned gold and shook in the October wind, and the creek ran cold and clear, and the cattle grew their winter coats and moved in the early morning fog like shapes out of a dream. Ralph took her out into the high country on a survey trip in October, 2 days riding into the ridgeline above the valley where he had worked to do mapping a new section. She had never been that high before, never seen the valley from above, and when they reached the ridge at midday and she could see the whole spread of it below, the creek glittering in the sun, the small shapes of her cattle in the pasture, the mountains beyond mountains rolling west toward California, she sat on her horse for a long time without speaking. "There's your land," he said, pointing to the section she knew. "I can see the fence lines," she said. "The northeast section is still the best green," he said. "Good water." "I know," she looked at it. "From up here it looks so small and so enormous at the same time." "That's the west," he said. They made camp that night on a flat shelf of rock with a view back down into the valley, and they cooked over a fire of dry juniper that smelled like nothing she had ever smelled before, sharp and sweet and entirely specific to this place. The stars were extraordinary at altitude. She lay on her back looking at them for a long time after they had eaten. "Ralph," she said, "are you happy here, in this valley? Is this where you want to stay?" She heard him move in the bedroll beside her. "Yes," he said. "This is where I want to stay. Is there something you want that you don't have?" A pause. The fire settled. A coyote called far down the ridge. "There's one thing," he said. She waited. "I would like to ask you something," he said, "but I want to ask it right." "You don't have to do it right," she said. "You just have to do it honestly." She heard him sit up. She sat up too, and they were facing each other across the low fire, and the starlight was very bright up here, and his face was clear and certain. "Stella Bristol," he said, "will you marry me?" It was not quite a question, which was appropriate because it was not something he was uncertain about. It had the same quality as everything he said, direct and meant. She looked at him. She thought about Cincinnati and the parlor and the laughter and the long road west and the orange evening light. The first night she stood at the gate and all the fence posts and the water rights and the cattle in the creek pasture and the dinner at the hotel and the kiss in the lamplight office. She thought about how she had come here to prove something to people who doubted her, and how she had proved it, absolutely and thoroughly, and how the unexpected thing was that the proving had mattered less to her now than she had expected it to, because she had found something that mattered more. Not instead of the land, not replacing the independence she had fought for, but alongside it and deepening it. She thought about the fact that he had never doubted her, not once, not from the first question about water rights. He had simply seen her as she was and proceeded accordingly, and she had not known until she experienced it what an extraordinary thing that was. "Yes," she said. "Obviously, yes." He came around the fire and put his arms around her, and she pressed her face against the warmth of his shoulder and felt the whole valley below them, her valley, and the stars above, and thought that this was not the ending of proving something, but the beginning of something that had no argument in it at all. They were married in Harlan Creek on the 15th of November, 1878, in the small Methodist church on the corner of 2nd and Ridgeline Streets. It was not a large wedding. The guest list was the honest guest list of two people who had made real friends in a real place, Mr. and Mrs. Haggerty from the general store, Louis Reyes and his new sweetheart from the Oaks family, Frank Odom, who stood with a slightly bewildered happiness, as though he had not entirely expected to be invited. Judge Warren, who performed the ceremony with the practiced warmth of a man who genuinely liked performing ceremonies, and half of the town of Harlan Creek who had come without invitation, because small towns do. Gerald Bristol had come back for the occasion, which had surprised Stella and moved her more than she let show. He stood in the front pew, and when she came down the aisle in her good blue dress with her dark hair pinned simply and her chin up in the way she always held her chin, Gerald's face did something complex that she recognized as a brother coming fully into understanding. She gave him a brief, acknowledging nod as she passed, and he nodded back, and it was, between them, a complete conversation. Ralph was waiting at the altar in a good dark coat and his hair properly cut, and when she reached him he took her hand and looked at her with that expression, the open, unguarded one, and she felt it all the way through. "You look like yourself," he said, just before the ceremony began, quiet enough that only she could hear. "The best possible thing," she said. "Yes," he said. The winter that followed was the first winter she had spent knowing what she was building toward. She learned the specific texture of winter in the Nevada high desert, the cold that arrived in earnest in December and settled in with the authority of a long-term tenant, the way the creek froze at the edges but kept running in the center, the way the cattle needed extra hay and careful watching in the deep cold snaps. Ralph moved into the house, and they expanded the main room before the worst of the cold came in, Ralph doing the carpentry with Frank's help while Louis and Stella handled the daily stock work. It was a good winter, crowded with work and close with warmth. They read in the evenings by the fire, both of them, which was not a thing Stella had expected to find in a husband but which she had found. He had a good collection of books, and she had brought 2 trunks of her own, and they traded back and forth with commentary that regularly turned into conversations that lasted past midnight. She wrote to her father in December. It was the longest letter she had written him since leaving Cincinnati. She told him about the property, which was now running 40 head of cattle and producing enough income to sustain itself comfortably. She told him about the house and the fencing and the winter preparations. She told him about Ralph, about the marriage, about all of it, with the specific clarity of someone who no longer needs to persuade, only to inform. Her father wrote back in January. The letter took 3 weeks to arrive, and she read it on the porch in the afternoon sun with her coffee, and she sat with it for a long time afterward. Her father said that he had misjudged the situation. He said he was glad she was well. He said he hoped she knew that his doubts had come from care, even if the expression of them had been wrong. He asked to meet Ralph, sometime when they might be traveling east, or if he and Stella's mother might come west in the spring. She showed the letter to Ralph that evening. He read it carefully. "He sounds like a man trying to find his way to something," he said. "He is," she said. "He is not a bad man. He is a man who was wrong about something important and is trying to be honest about it." "You should write back," Ralph said. "I already did," she said. He looked at her with a smile that was not quite on his face but that she could see anyway in the warmth of his eyes. "Of course you did," he said. "Spring returned to the valley with the particular insistence of spring in a place that has had a real winter. The creek ran high with meltwater. The grass came back green and urgent. The cattle moved to the high pasture with a purposefulness that made Stella think the animals knew the land better than she did and were leading the way. She expanded the herd to 60 head in April, purchasing carefully from 2 different sellers to get good variety. Ralph completed a major survey contract for a land company in Reno, the biggest he had taken, and the payment meant that they could make the barn improvements they had been planning since autumn and still have savings to carry through a lean year if one came. The Coulter brothers had been quiet since the water rights dismissal. Dale had nodded to Stella once in the general store, with the sulky courtesy of a man who has given up a fight but not made peace with the loss. Pierce had not acknowledged her directly. She did not expect friendship from them, only the functioning neutrality that she was prepared to enforce if necessary. It was functioning. That was sufficient. On a morning in early May, she stood at the northeast fence, the fence she had repaired in her first spring with Ralph standing beside her handing her wire staples, and she looked at the cattle in the Green Creek pasture with the ridgeline blue beyond them and the sky enormous overhead, and she thought about the parlor in Cincinnati and the laughter and the leather chair, and all the voices telling her what she could not do. She had done it. She had done it entirely, beginning to end. Cattle and water rights and fencing and land management and accounts ledger and all of it. And the doing of it had made it hers in a way that went deeper than the deed in the attorney's office. The land was hers because she had worked it and learned it and made it function, and the proving had been real and complete. But it had also, somewhere in the middle of itself, become something more than a proof. It had become her life. Ralph came up behind her and stood beside her at the fence and followed her gaze out to the pasture. Thinking, he asked. Always, she said. About what? About what I came here to do and what I ended up doing, she said. They're the same thing in terms of the work. But they're different in terms of what they mean. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, You proved them wrong. Thoroughly, she said. How does it feel? She thought about it honestly. Smaller than I expected, she said, and larger than I expected, both at the same time. The proving feels small now because it was always about them and what they thought, and they and what they thought feel far away. But what I built feels large. This, she gestured at the pasture, at the house behind them, at the whole length of the valley. This feels enormous. Because it's real, he said. Because it's real, she agreed. He put an arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him, and they stood at the fence in the morning sun, and looked at the cattle in the green pasture and the creek running silver behind them. She was going to have a child. She had known it for 3 weeks and had been carrying the knowledge with the careful internal attention of someone handling something precious and fragile. She had not yet said it out loud, but standing there in the morning light with Ralph's arm around her, she thought that today was the day. I have something to tell you, she said. He looked at her. He read her expression the way he read everything, with full attention, and she watched him understand. We're going to have a child, she said. The expression that moved across his face was one she had never seen on him before and would carry with her for the rest of her life. It was not just happiness, though it was that. It was something more complete, a kind of full and present astonishment, as if the world had just rearranged itself into a shape more generous than he had expected. He turned fully toward her and took both her hands. Stella, he said, and there was so much in the word that it did not need anything added. Probably autumn, she said. I think October. October, he repeated. He was still holding her hands. He looked at her with the clear, unguarded look she had loved from the beginning. Are you well? Are you? I am entirely well, she said. I intend to be entirely well all the way through. I am not going to treat this as an incapacity. I know, he said. I would not expect you to. And then quietly, I am so glad. So am I, she said, more than I knew how to expect. They stood there at the fence in the May sun, with the news of it between them and the valley around them, and the long grassland reaching all the way to the ridgeline. And Stella thought that she had come west with a plan that she had understood very clearly, and the plan had worked. And in the middle of the plan working, something else had happened that she had not planned at all, and it was the best thing in a life that was now, genuinely and irrevocably, her own. Stella's parents came west in June. It had been her mother's idea, according to the letter, though she suspected her father had needed less persuading than he let on. They arrived on a Tuesday afternoon on the Reno stage, her father Thomas Bristol looking slightly bewildered by the scale of the landscape, and her mother Catherine looking around at everything with bright, acute eyes that Stella recognized as her own eyes in an older face. Her mother stepped off the stage and looked at Stella for a long moment, taking in the work clothes and the sun on her face and the way she stood, and then she came forward and embraced her with a warmth that had years of compressed things in it. "You look wonderful," her mother said into her shoulder. "You look like you found yourself." "I found myself a long time ago," Stella said. "I just came west to let everyone else catch up." Her mother laughed. Her father shook her hand with the slight stiffness of a man who is in the process of revising something important, and then, to her surprise, he pulled her into a brief, genuine embrace that she received with the complicated grace of a daughter who has been waiting for it. She introduced them to Ralph that evening at dinner. Her father and Ralph talked about land values and the changing character of the Nevada territory, and the practical business of water rights for 2 hours, while her mother sat next to Stella and said very little but watched everything with the particular sharpness of a woman who has been waiting to evaluate a man for her daughter's sake. Later, in the kitchen, her mother said, "He looks at you the way your father looked at me before he got conventional." "Then I hope he never gets conventional," Stella said. "I don't think there's much risk of that," her mother said, and she was smiling in a way that made Stella's chest ache pleasantly. Her parents stayed a week. Her father walked the property with her on the second morning and asked intelligent questions about the cattle operation with the honesty of a man who is genuinely trying to learn something he had assumed he already knew. When she showed him the accounts ledger, he studied it for a long time. "This is a sound operation," he said. "Yes," she said. "I was wrong about what you could do," he said. "Yes," she said again. He looked at her. "I am sorry, Stella." She looked back at her father. This man she had been in argument with for years, in the long Nevada morning light, with the cattle visible in the pasture behind him and the creek running beyond that. She saw him clearly as she had seen Gerald clearly, as a man who had been wrong not out of cruelty but out of the failure of imagination that convention produces, and who was trying now to see past it. "I know," she said, "and I accept it. I just need you to know that this," she looked at the land, "the whole length of it. This is not a thing I did in spite of you. It's a thing I did for myself, and I need that to be understood." "It is understood," he said, with a quiet dignity that she respected. She nodded. They walked back to the house side by side, and something that had been unresolved between them for years settled into a new configuration that was not perfect but was honest, which was better. Her parents left on Friday, and she stood at the stage depot with Ralph's hand warm in hers and watched the stage carry them east, and felt the particular free, clear feeling of a relationship that has been renegotiated and can now proceed on better terms. Summer moved toward autumn. The ranch work continued with the deep-rooted rhythm she had come to love. Louis Reyes announced in August that he intended to marry the Oaks girl, whose name was Maria, and Stella gave him a raise that made him look startled and grateful in equal measure. Frank Odom turned out to have a gift for horse handling that she had not initially recognized, and she extended his role accordingly. The cattle were healthy, and the creek ran well through the dry months and the fence held. She grew through the summer with the comfortable unself-consciousness of a woman who had no reason to hide from her own body's processes, and every reason to go on working, which she did, adjusting the work as the season advanced and her shape changed, and the baby made itself more known. Ralph was attentive without being hovering, which was the only mode of attention she could have tolerated. He learned how to read the signs that she needed to rest without her having to say it, and she learned how to let herself be cared for without treating it as a defeat. In September, Ralph finished the new room he had been building onto the north side of the house. It was a real room, properly plastered and floored, with a window that faced east for the morning light. She stood in it when it was done and ran her hand along the window sill and thought about the small person who would grow up with this light falling across them every morning. "It's good work," she said. "I measured it twice," he said. "I never doubted it," she said, and the echo of the sentence between them was warm and full. October arrived in a blaze of color, the aspens in the high draws burning gold, the cottonwoods along the creek turning yellow against the blue sky. On the 14th of October, a Sunday, their son was born in the stone house beside the creek, delivered by Mrs. Alvarez, the midwife who served the South Valley, with Ralph sitting in the hall on the other side of the door in the patient stillness of a man whose form of prayer is very quiet but very intense. When the door opened and she told him to come in, he came into the room and Stella was sitting up in the bed with the baby in her arms, her hair loose, and her face carrying the particular exhaustion and radiance that have no equivalent in any other human experience. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the baby, a red-faced, serious-looking person with a remarkable quantity of dark hair, and his expression was the one she had seen the morning she told him, the full and present astonishment, but larger now and more permanent. "He looks very serious," Ralph said. "He has opinions," Stella said. "Already, I can tell." "I would expect nothing less," Ralph said, and he reached out one careful finger and the baby wrapped his hand around it with the grip strength that always surprises people who haven't encountered it before. And Ralph said very quietly, "Hello." She watched them, her son and her husband in the October morning light in the room they had built together, on the land she had come west to prove she could run, beside the creek that was hers by right and by work and by love. They named him William Thomas Holloway. William for her uncle, who had left her the land that had changed everything. Thomas for her father, because she was capable of generosity now in a way that the Cincinnati parlor had not made easy, and because her father had come a long way in a short time, and she thought the gesture would mean something to him, which it did, when she wrote to tell him. He wrote back a letter that her mother later told her had been rewritten 4 times before he sent it, and which contained, in its final version, the words that she had needed from him for many years, simply and plainly set down. The winter of 1879 was cold and long and entirely good. The ranch came through it sound. Louis and Maria were married in December in a small bright ceremony at the church in Harlan Creek, and Stella stood as Maria's witness in the second pew, and Ralph stood as Louis's, and afterward they all had dinner at the hotel dining room with the Haggertys and Frank Odom and half a dozen others, and it was the kind of evening that accumulates into the history of a place. William Thomas learned to hold his own head up in January. He was, as his mother had predicted, a person of opinions. He watched the world around him with large, attentive dark eyes that were unmistakably his father's, and he responded to sound with the focused interest of someone taking notes. Stella fed him and held him and worked the ranch around him with the particular practical love of a woman who had learned that the world bends to those who refuse to let it break them. In the spring of 1880, when William Thomas was taking his first uncertain steps across the flagstone floor of the kitchen, and the cattle were moved back to the creek pasture for the 3rd time, and the fence lines were checked and found sound, and the water rights were firm and unchallenged, and the accounts showed a property that was not merely surviving but genuinely thriving. Stella Bristol Holloway stood at the northeast fence on a morning in April with her son on her hip and her husband beside her, and looked at the valley that was hers. She thought about the parlor in Cincinnati. She thought about the laughter. She thought about what she had come here to prove and who she had come here to prove it to. And she thought about how the proving had happened, cleanly and completely, and how it had turned out to be only the beginning of something much longer and more interesting. She thought about a man who had given her directions to his office and handed her wire staples and ridden out at sunset to warn her about a legal attack, and said "I love you" in the starlight on a high ridge as simply and certainly as he said everything, because he was a person who believed in saying what was true. "What are you thinking about?" Ralph asked. She looked at him over the top of William Thomas's head, this man who had never doubted her, not once, not for a single moment from the first afternoon in the lamplight office with the maps on the walls, the man who had seen her and gone on seeing her exactly as she was, and whose faith in her had not instructed her or managed her but had simply stood beside her like the creek ran beside the fence line, constant and clear. "I'm thinking," she said, "that I got exactly what I came for." He reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her face with the particular gentleness he always had, even when they were both muddy and tired from the work. "Just what you came for?" he asked. "And considerably more," she said. William Thomas made a decisive noise and reached toward the fence post with the authority of a person who intends to touch it, and Ralph steadied her arm as she let the boy explore the rough wood with his small fingers. And the creek ran behind them, and the cattle moved in the green pasture, and the Nevada sky was enormous overhead, blue and clean and full of light. The years that followed were years of good work and real love, and the specific, irreplaceable satisfaction of a life built on an honest foundation. They had a second child, a girl they named Catherine after Stella's mother, who arrived in the summer of 1882 with the same volume of opinions as her brother and a gift for charming anyone she met that she deployed with considerable effectiveness from approximately 18 months old. William Thomas became, as he grew, a serious and observant boy who followed both his parents through their respective domains with focused attention, learning the land from his mother and the maps from his father. The Coulter brothers sold their north section in 1883 and relocated to California. The day Stella heard the news from Mr. Haggerty, she bought herself a piece of lemon candy from the glass jar on the counter and walked out into the spring sun feeling nothing in particular, which was itself a satisfying feeling, the feeling of a threat that had simply become irrelevant. Ralph's survey work grew through the early 1880s as the Nevada territory continued to develop, and he took on apprentices, 2 young men in consecutive years, whom he trained with the same patient directness he brought to everything. He published a survey map of the entire Harlan Creek Valley in 1884 that was used by the county assessor and became the standard reference for land disputes in the area for the next 2 decades. In the lower corner of the map, in his neat, steady hand, he had written R. Holloway, Survey, 1884, and below that in a slightly different ink, S. Bristol Holloway, Proprietor, South Creek Road, as if she were part of the geography, which she was. She wrote to her father twice a year, and he wrote back, and the letters between them became over time something honest and warm, the correspondence of 2 people who had reached an understanding that was not without its scars but was genuine. Her father visited again in 1881, and this time he got down on the ground with William Thomas and showed him how to bait a fishing line with a patience and a tenderness that Stella watched from the porch with complicated feelings that resolved, finally, into simple gladness. Gerald visited nearly every other year and brought his own wife, a practical woman named Anne who got on famously with Stella from the first afternoon, and who had opinions about cattle management that were, if anything, more direct than Stella's own. The 2 of them became a friendship that neither had expected and both treasured. Harlan Creek itself grew through the 1880s, as towns in the Nevada territory grew, steadily, and with the particular character of places that are becoming rather than becoming something else. New buildings went up on the main street. A school was established in 1881, and Stella served on the school board from its founding, which annoyed exactly the people she expected it to annoy and was supported by exactly the people she expected to support it. Mrs. Darby died in 1882 and left her husband the hotel and a letter that, according to Mr. Darby, had said everything she had not said in 30 years of marriage. Mr. Darby read the letter and cried for an afternoon, and then ran the hotel with a new warmth that everyone in town noticed. Louis and Maria Reyes had 3 children in the first 5 years of their marriage, and their household had a noise and a joy to it that made the Bristol Holloway place, just half a mile up the creek road, seem quieter by comparison until William Thomas and Catherine began to account for themselves. The children grew up together, and their friendship became the kind that grows roots. On an evening in the spring of 1885, 7 years after she had stepped off the stage in Harlan Creek and nearly been knocked down by a loose horse, Stella sat on the porch of the house she had inherited and expanded and made entirely her own, with the creek audible below the pasture and the sky going through its daily performance of impossible color, and she had the absolute, grounded certainty of a life that was right. Not perfect. She had learned in 7 years of Nevada that perfect was a concept that the land had no patience for, and that honest was more durable anyway. But right, hers. Built on work and love and the refusal to be seen as less than what she was, and the remarkable luck of finding a person who had never needed to be asked to see her clearly. William Thomas came out of the house at a run and vaulted over the porch railing in the way she had told him 14 times not to do, and Catherine followed him at a more deliberate pace, and Ralph came out behind them, both carrying 2 cups of coffee and stepping around Catherine with the ease of long practice, and he handed Stella her cup and sat down beside her in the other chair. "Long day," he said. "Good day," she said. "Both," he agreed. The children ran out into the evening pasture in the long horizontal light, 2 small serious people running for the joy of it through the tall spring grass, and the cattle watched them from across the fence with the mild interest cattle have for most things, and the creek ran on. She reached over and took Ralph's hand. He folded his fingers around hers without looking, the way you do with something you have held so long it is part of your shape. "I never wrote back to tell my father whether I'd be here for spring roundup," she said. "I know," Ralph said. "You told me that story once." "I've been here for 7 spring roundups," she said. "You have. That seems like a sufficient answer." "I think so," he said. She looked at the land. Her land. The creek and the pasture and the fence she had repaired by hand in her first spring, and the cattle and the evening sky and the 2 children running through the grass, and the man beside her with his warm hand around hers, and everything in her that had arrived here angry and determined and burning to prove something was at peace, not because the fire had gone out, but because the fire had found what it had actually been looking for all along. A place that was hers, a life that was real, a love that had never asked her to be less. She drank her coffee in the evening light and thought that this was more than enough. It was, in fact, everything.